You know, we're just asked to do something. We know that we don't have the capability of performing it to our optimal, and we know the costs would be high. And with that knowledge, you then manage your organization. Or you may say, these changes are permanent. You know, the demand for whites are going up greatly, so I need a new type of sewing machine that's better for white, that has less oil on it. And finally, there are physical limits. What we found is the machines could handle material thickness between one level and another. But if you got too thick or too thin, it did not work at all. So again, every process has its sweet spot, it has its normal, its area where it can do it but not efficiently, and it has its physical limitations. By understanding these factors, we can gain a lot more insight into the actual cost, efficiency, and value creation of our processes.
So for example, if I'm drinking tea, and I might use a teaspoon, but if I'm trying to serve a big bowl of mashed potatoes, that little teaspoon isn't very efficient. So I have to make some decisions. If I'm in the restaurant business, I better go out and buy some big spoons to serve mashed potatoes. On the other hand, if I'm at home, that teaspoon probably still doesn't work. Likewise, when I have cereal, a cereal spoon is usually larger than a teaspoon, and that's where capital budgeting comes into play, because then I can make some decisions. Either I eat cereal with a teaspoon, which is inefficient, or I become more efficient, but I have to invest those capital dollars. Okay, well, let's move on to corollary 1C. Man-made processes exist to create societal value. Okay, I thought processes were to make me rich, Jim. Well, why do I care about societal value?
I think one of the most underdeveloped part of management is that we focus on profits rather than value creation. If we create value, profits follow. If we go purely for profits, we often begin to lose sight of the value that our organization is creating for society, and as a consequence, we eventually, it catches up with us and we get into deep trouble. I think the vast majority of organizations that have struggled, you can pinpoint back to their losing sight of society and what they really want, and just keeping on doing what they've always done for as long as they've done it.
So if we look at Apple Computer, when they came up with their iPhone, that obviously caused a stir, and millions of people were interested in an iPhone. And now they've come up with the iPad, and it looks like that's going to be a tremendous seller because they're providing value in the marketplace, and by providing value in the marketplace, they have increased their stock market value.
Absolutely. And so the key here is our traditional management systems have tended to look more at cost and revenue, a very short-term view of the world. And we have done a very poor job of measuring value. The future management systems must do a much better job of understanding and managing the value organizations create, in addition to the the profits and losses. And so, so in the future, and part of what we're going to be developing throughout these slides is keeping our eyes on the value creation, not just the profit and loss.
Well, my name is Johnny Antos, and my good friend Jim Brimson and I would like to thank you for joining our series here on the process laws and business process management. In our next series, we will talk about some of the other process laws, and we will hope you will join us. This is John Antos, and I would like to welcome you to our series on business process management. This is my good friend Jim Brimson here, and we appreciate your coming back to see about business process management. Well, obviously there's a bunch of process laws, and one of the process laws deals with all processes vary. Well, Jim, kind of help me understand that. When I go to the store and get coffee, it seems pretty much the same to me every time. And if I go to the store and I see 6 lamps, they look pretty much the same. So how could processes vary?
Well, all processes vary. I mean, there's never been 2 cans of coffee that have ever been alike in mankind. And that is because of basically three conditions that exist. The first one is the initial set of conditions that exist at the time the process is executed. So if you were to look at a can, every time the machine operates to make that can, it has a different set of conditions than it was when the previous one. It's worn a little bit different. Everything is slightly different. The next set of conditions that causes it to be very different are the environmental conditions. So perhaps
Get more humidity in the air or less humidity in the air, it's hotter, it's warmer, the operator in that environment is tired or less tired, more alert, less alert.
so all those things go into being slightly different. And then the third set is the resources themselves. Now that's where the operator is tired, or the coffee grinds might be a little different from one can to another because they were picked from a different area. So those are all the things that cause variation and in a process.
Okay, and obviously the goal is that all processes have this variation, but we want to make that variation as small as possible because we don't want 12 ounces of coffee to be 6 ounces one time and 18 ounces the other time. Either we're giving away product and not getting paid for it, or we are shorting the customer, which is not good.
Absolutely. So the key is that customers really notice variation in processes. So if you have a cup of coffee and it is different from one can to another, it's something and you notice it, then that's a problem. Because what customers want is consistency rather than variation in the process.
So that's where you were talking about an activity-based costing. We talked about inputs and the process and the output, but we really didn't spend enough time back then talking about these conditions, these initial conditions, the environment, and the resources, as you told us on a previous tape.
Absolutely. As I say, it's critical to understand that variation exists. There's nothing that you can do to eliminate it, but you can minimize it to the point where the customer does not see any adverse impact by it.
So it sounds like this corollary 2A is exactly what we've been talking about, is the initial conditions, the environment, the resources, and all we can ask is to get it into an acceptable range, because we know it's impossible for everything to be exactly the same over and over again.
Yes, and it also impacts our management practices, since we want to be able to consider the effect of variation on processes and to realize that every process is going to vary. Therefore, it's going to have a range of outputs. It's important to measure that range using more statistical techniques than perhaps we've incorporated in management practices in the past.
So just like we talked about driving the car down the road, as long as we stay within those white lines, we're for the most part be pretty safe. When we go outside those white lines, that's where we can get in trouble, and that's exactly what happens to processes. There's a certain acceptable range of each process, and we want to stay within that range.
That's correct. And also, statistics talks about two important factors with variation. And one factor is whether the variation is in control or out of control. And we're going to elaborate that in a couple future presentations.
Okay, so